completely misunderstand what Heidegger meant by nihilism.
Yes.
In his conversations with Ernst Jünger, I think it was, he talks about how Europe must inevitably pass through a period of nihilism. You know, I mean, it's not as it's good or bad, it's just inevitable. You know, the question is whether it'll come out the other side or not.
Yes.
Something to that effect, I think. Now, I read that long, long ago before I ever tried to read Heidegger's texts, but, you know, the leftists who have a prior investment in the idea that Nazism, and Hitler in particular, were nihilists, from their point of view, they insist that Hitler had no principles, no values, no ideals, that he was simply a manipulator. And, you know, massive false texts like the Hermann Reichning's Conversations with Hitler were produced more specifically to sell this idea that Hitler was a soulless manipulator. So leftists, having that background, when they read Heidegger's remarks about this period of nihilism, they think that it's the Hitler period he's referring to. But in fact, it's precisely the opposite. Heidegger, I think, saw Nazism as a defense of Europe against nihilism. I mean, nihilism is related to communism in the thought of that period. That communism is a reduction of, not just of ethics, but of all philosophical categories to zero. You know? So the fight against nihilism, in his mind, would have been very similar to the fight against communism in Hitler's mind. Would you agree?
It's also, yes, and it's also relates to aesthetic ideals within religiosity. A soul or an inner consciousness, let's say, a higher inner consciousness, fights against non-belief, against doubt, against unbelief, and so does a civilization. It wrestles with the prospect of meaning as absence. Because if you can't have that counter proposition before you, like darkness and light, or life and death, you can't think without an oppositional polarity. Much Western thinking proceeds oppositionally, proceeds by wrestling with that which needs to be overcome. Because the idea of nihilism, which in itself is also a very complicated idea, because is it possible for any period of time for a group or even an individual to sustain what nihilism really means? The prospect of believing that everything is purposeless. Even the Sartrean idea that you step back from purposelessness and volitionalize it through commitment, again is a denial of nihilism. He's gone there and doesn't want to stay.
Well, I think the relationship with communism might lie in materialism, because you probably won't agree here, because you said something that suggested you're a materialist yourself.
Well, a Nietzschean.
Well, but I mean, the person who comes to mind is not really an ideal example, but Guénon, who argues that materialism, in the reign of quantity and books like that, that materialism is really a stage in the process of reduction of the universe to absolutely zero, to nil. I mean, matter is the last stop before nothingness.
Yes, Heidegger is, within the discourse of continental advanced Western philosophizing, a perennialist and a traditionalist, really, for whom the most agreeable semiotic of truth and purpose probably would be the Catholicism of his youth. But in actual fact, he doesn't want to get belaboured by that. He would much rather approach the entire question theoretically. Yes, that the interesting thing for most of our species, though, is that look at the Muslim world now. One truth, one purpose, death for those who are excluded from it, at least in accordance with certain definitions of it, in a militant vanguard way. And that is a type of militantly essentialist thinking that the Western mind, in my view, can't encompass. Because it's not that it's cretinous, it's just it's not the way we perceive reality. Even the most, you see, I mean, I know certain Catholics who, one or two, became Muslims after Vatican II. They left the Catholic Church because they wanted an absolute structure. They didn't want any revisionism, if you like, within Christianity at all. They had to have total and utter certainty. And these are advanced people. They're not people lying in the sand being told what to think by a bloke who's up there with a beard. You know, these are people who almost need that degree of certainty. Most people are comfortable with no certainty at all. Liberals can live with unbelievable areas of uncertainty. even the language they use, they'll say, well, I do agree with you, but on the other hand, there's this proposition here, but he's got another view, and of course that needs to be canvassed for reasons of inclusion, and they're hopping all over, because they can never draw it down. Sometimes materiality is necessary, actually, to deal with elements of casuistry and relativism at the moment. Do you see what I mean? That it's part of a concretization, because liberalism itself has become so deconstructive, even of itself, because I think contemporary postmodern liberal ideas are devouring themselves at a level of theory. They're eating themselves up, and of course there will come a moment when you do eat yourself completely, and you need the only way to go forwards. The interesting notion of the avant-garde in the last 200 years, the only way to go forwards will be to go back. You can't go forwards any further. So if you're ever going to progress at all, and we believe in the idea that we should progress, in that sense I've always resisted the notion that people to the right of that which is regarded as centrist or even moderately right-wing are reactionaries. We want to progress in another area and go in another direction. And I personally think that these philosophical matters are of crucial importance, which is why at a material and political level, if you want to use this terminology, Heidegger made an extreme choice. And although an anti-existentialist theoretically, look at the choice he made, because that choice in 1933 wasn't just to fit in cynically with the regime that had come in. It was a sort of a total choice, a religious choice, really. And I suppose there was partiality for the governments in both Germany and Italy, probably deep down more the one in Germany than in Italy, really, was of a similar order. I think Evola said several things, that in creation to modernity there were several responses, one of which was to just join in, I suppose. One was to kill yourself and have a done with it. One was to ground yourself in the essential purpose of prior traditions which are transcendental in character. And the other is Nietzscheanism, let's put it that way, sort of power morality and the prospect of self-transcendence outside systems in a world where all systems have collapsed, or seem to have collapsed.
Well, I gather Italian fascism is much more based on Hegel via Giovanni Gentili.
That's right.
So that's a big difference there. I
yes.
mean, Hegel, you said there's a kind of a postscript about Hegel there.
Criticising him,
but,
yes.
You know, I mean, it is still possible to take Hegel seriously, in my view.
Yes, the Italians did, and...
What's the Hegel postscript?
Let's have a look.
What, Hegel undermined what Heidegger was saying?
No, that Hegel had interesting ideas about the conception of time and of the ideas between time and spirit, Geist. But at the same time, in some ways, Nietzsche, Heidegger in a crude way is playing whist. Someone who's got a good hand, but he produces an ace at the end of his book and puts it down to say, I've won this round, you know. So there's a little bit of that. And that's, in a sense, Heidegger's human element, if you want to put it human. The humanism of a non-humanist, if you like. The fact he did care what other intellectuals said about him and went to war ferociously against other detractors, of whom there are many. Adorno was asked by a woman at a party once, she said, well, at least Heidegger, Professor Adorno, has placed man before death. And he said, Ludendorff did that. You know, which is a good answer, you know, but so what? You know, it's just salon talk, isn't it, really? You know, and in a way, Adorno is another rival absolute. Adorno sits there, you've seen his New Left photos of him with one hand cupped in his face, saying it's all misery. The culture industry is everywhere. Everything is destroyed. Interesting streak of cultural conservatism in this high Marxist, if you like. And Adorno's there, poetry after Auschwitz shouldn't even be permitted, which is one of his famous lines, you know, from Minimum Moravia. We should have no glory again because there's been a few massacres. Well, Heidegger's response would be, if he bothered to look at these things at all, that massacre's just a speeded up process anyway. You know, because life will end in the massacre of death, if you like. So there's a degree to which he would regard that as a moralistic and slightly bitter-minded remark outside the scope of true study, basically, you know, and toss him this. But